Okay, well, a very good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this BA community webinar. Now, you will have seen the abstract. We're going to talk about the similarities and differences between business analysis and systems analysis. Now, I know many people tuned into this webinar will perhaps be business analysts, but some of you may well have a systems analysis background as well. And there's always some controversy as to where those boundaries lie. There might be some grey areas that we can discuss. And I'm really pleased to say that we have three very experienced thought leaders in this area who are going to talk to us about these topics. And I'm sure for many of you that they'll need no introduction. But we have Deborah Paul with us, and amongst many other things, Deborah is Managing Director of Assist Knowledge Development. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Assist. Assist is a training and consultancy company specialising in business analysis and business architecture. But I'm sure many of us will also know Debbie from the books she's written, edited and co-authored, including, of course, the Business Analysis book, the BA Techniques book, Agile and Business Analysis, The Human Touch, and many, many more. Debbie's indeed a regular keynote speaker on all things BA and has even conducted doctoral research into the role of the business analyst, which is very, very fascinating. So thanks for joining us, Debbie. We have Stefan Bossuwe, who's one of the founders of the IIBA Brussels chapter. I can see you laughing. I tried to pronounce your surname correctly, Stefan.
You should try phonetic writing.
I tried. So one of the founders of the IIBA Brussels chapter, which was established 10 years ago. And in fact, that's how Stefan and I know each other. We were both on IIBA chapter boards, and it's fair to say that we were both very vocal members of the European IIBA community. Stefan has a really broad experience of business analysis, and in 2012 was the first CBAP in Belgium, which is a real achievement. And he now spends much of his time promoting the BA profession, is an international speaker, and is very enthusiastic about the holistic role of the BA, which is a passion I certainly share. And last but by no means least, we have Craig Jeffries. Craig has extensive experience in business analysis. He holds the BCS diploma, but doesn't regard himself as a career BA. He is instead interested in how analysis plays into the adjacent fields of business design, architecture, and strategic analysis. And in fact, and I didn't know this, so I've known Craig for a while, but I didn't know until I read your bio that you've had such varied roles as head of management accounts, internal audit, business analysis manager, and commercial director. So a whole wide-ranging career. So he brings this experience and his maverick nature to the projects that he works on. So welcome to our panelists. In terms of our first discussion point, and it's a broad and open question of what is the difference between a business analyst and a systems analyst, as those terms are commonly in common currency, so as they're commonly used. We've talked about systems thinking, but sort of if we park that for a moment and think more about how the term is sort of consistently used. So I mean, Craig, if I pick on you first, or invite you first, I should say, what would you say the difference? What would you say the difference is between a business analyst and a systems analyst?
Right, being simple, which is my trademark, the clues in the title. Business analyst is more focused on the business, systems analyst is more focused on the system. I think the area of requirements tends to be in that nexus. It's like two ends of a spectrum, there's a crossover. But I was just looking at an advert that Stefan has put up for the co-op systems analyst, and I think the interesting bit there is it's on about experience of the complex integrated environments, multiple technologies, very much a focus on the detail level, data flow diagrams, entity ERDs, digging into the data, understanding the systems and how they function. Whereas a BA, we always say we are solution agnostic. I think for a system analyst, you can't be. You need to understand your networks, your protocols, how the technology fits together. And the one thing I'd say is I was at a large bank, and I was looking at the use cases, I hadn't realised their business analysts were really systems analysts, and it was like reading Visual Basic Code.
Yeah.
It was full of if, then, go to. It's an incredible, and there was about 14 pages, and it only described about 3 activities, and it fried my brain, and that's when I realised I probably wasn't a system analyst.
So like pseudocode you were reading there.
Exactly, that was the phrase I was after, and it sounds like that. And so I'm not saying business analysts can't do that, and I think it's like what we're covering today. The question is, should they be doing that? And I think a lot of BAs would be uncomfortable getting that down to physical level data and that type of thing. Personally. Yeah.
So I mean, Debbie, if I bring you in here and get your perspective on the difference between business analysis and systems analysis, and one particular area which I'd use as a provocative thing to perhaps bring in is value is on that BACCM, and I wondered whether you might have any perspectives on value.
Yeah, I do have perspectives on value, interestingly enough, Adrian, as you know.
I know too. I followed your presentation in London last year.
Because I do think we throw around the word value just a little bit too easily sometimes. And we declare ourselves as delivering value all over the place, and you can't. And I think as a business person, if I really could just tell the whole world that I delivered value, and everybody would just accept that, that would be marvelous. What you have to do is offer something that could be valuable, but it's not actually up to you to determine that it is valuable, because value is determined by the person who receives it, not the person delivering it. But having said that, so thank you, Adrian.
Sorry about that, Debbie.
You haven't given me my moment for my soapbox. I do think it's an interesting way to look at the systems analysis, business analysis. I was going to say divide, but two separate areas. Because actually, when I was a systems analyst, as I said earlier, I'd actually come from a business background before going into a business change role. So I was working as a systems analyst where we knew we were working on the software, we were working on the IT system. And I think Craig said something about banded, which is a very good word, because actually the boundary that we were looking at, yes, there was functionality that might come in or out, but by and large, we had some very, very clear ideas on where we were going. And although we weren't actually coding or even designing within the context of the technology, we did have to understand enough about it to know we had to give sufficient information that the people doing the designing and coding could actually take it and actually do what we said, basically. So we had to have a very good understanding of the technical environment. Interestingly enough, though, there was still scope for business options within systems analysis. And in some of the projects I worked on, the actual technical environment wasn't necessarily decided up front. We knew it was going to be software, but we didn't actually know all of the details of the technology. So that was part of it as well. But business analysis was always something that I felt would be important. Even though it wasn't a very well-known term at the time, because if we talk about value, this is maybe a little bit controversial, but I think the best systems analysts actually understood business context, and they were a bit more comfortable with understanding the need to look after the people, understanding the fact that you did need to make sure that processes adapted to this new software, and understanding that there were all sorts of aspects within the business context that you needed to think about, and sometimes they were a bit ambiguous. So, so I sort of think for me, a great systems analyst actually would always think about the business context, but their focus would be on this bounded software system. A business analyst actually starts with less of a boundary, because it is a lot more ambiguous and open. And so whilst both might look at options, the options in the BA world, I think, tend to be much more varied.
Interesting, interesting. So with that in mind, the question which is now springing to my mind is, wherever that boundary is drawn between business analysis and systems analysis, and whatever that overlap is, what would happen if one was missing? And have you ever seen, have you ever seen a situation where one of those disciplines was missing? So actually, Debbie, that feeds on quite nicely from your answer. So maybe you'd like to have a crack at that one.
To be honest with you, I've seen it missing a lot. And I think if you look back over the last 20 years maybe in our industry, I think you can see exactly where elements of that really rigorous systems analysis has been missing. And one of the primary areas is around data. I think non-functional requirements is another area, but it sort of aligns with the data in some ways. We seem to have moved into a role that is very keen on process for many years. And actually, if we don't understand data, and if we're not comfortable with understanding changes to data, coming back to the BACCM that Stefan put up, we've got to understand the dynamic view of systems, whether they're business systems or software. And understanding what that means for data is really, really important. And I think there has been quite a lot of gaps that have emerged because the systems analyst role really began to be very diminished, I would say, in the late 1990s. And because of that, we moved away from maybe some of the more detailed, more rigorous aspects of the system because they were perceived to be in some ways technical. Some of the language used around it was quite complicated in some ways, and some of the modeling was quite complicated, but actually some of it was incredibly important. I think the other area where there has been gaps is around business rules. Because if you don't really analyze, if you don't really get down into the details sometimes, actually you can really overlook some very complex business rules. And those business rules nowadays are often embedded inside computer systems, so even the end users don't know the business rules.
Absolutely. And
somebody has got to get that level of detail out, and it doesn't tend to be done sometimes within the BA role. And those are the two areas of gap that I've perceived.
It's really interesting. I was sort of nodding along as you were talking there, Debbie. And one thing I remember you saying about 5 years ago, but it's stuck with me ever since, is if you don't know the data, you don't know the requirements. And I think that's very, very true, but people sometimes shy away, particularly from high level data modeling. Yeah. And although I think this is probably, there would be some in the BA community who would disagree with this, I think that it's interesting because if you think about data, the information that the business cares enough about to store and process, and you think about business rules, well, actually, in order to write business rules, you've really got to have a common business vocabulary. And where do you get, how do you get to a common business vocabulary? Well, you have to know the data you're processing. So the two have a sort of dotted line connection between them. So it's interesting those are the two things that are getting neglected. So
I couldn't agree more, Adrian. I really couldn't. And I think that if you really can understand data, and when I was a systems analyst, it was very much what was called data-driven analysis. So we actually started by modeling data. And, sitting down with people, and I've sat down with marketing directors, I've sat down with salespeople, with operational business managers, and talked them through data models. But I haven't called it a data model. I've just talked them through what information do you need to record and process here, and looked at what that means. It is astonishing how easy it is to have that discussion and how much comes out of it.
I remember, we may have had this discussion before, but I remember one financial services company I was working on a project where, because I tend to just draw data models for my own understanding, even if they're not needed for the project, because it just helps me get my head around what all these things mean. And there was this thing about, it was an investment product with joint policyholder. and everyone had assumed that joint policyholder meant no more than two, because it's, you know, it's partners or husband and wife or whatever. And then when I was drawing this data model and I was having the conversation, of saying, oh, no, there are some institutional policies where they're written in trust for a pension provider, and all the individual trustees or whatever are named on there. So I was like, oh, wow, good job we found that then, isn't it, type of thing. And that was only through literally a pencil mark on a paper type of thing. So
Yeah.
Fantastic. So Stefan, what's your view on what would happen if one of those roles were missing, and have you ever seen that?
Well, I have worked in that in the 90s, and just one thing what Debbie said, like the business rules in the code. I remember also mid-90s, I'm working for a big financial company in Luxembourg, and I was really sitting next to a guy through the COBOL code and writing down the business rules, which I then moved into a Word document with lots of if analysis, like Greg mentioned just earlier. But to be honest, until 2005, between 2005 and 2010, in Belgium, we were only working with system analysts, functional analysts. We didn't work with business analysts. It's a role that came up around 2008, 2010, and now today it's more common. But if you look at the contents, they want to let people do system analysis. So if you have a job description and you look at the contents, you're like, okay, it's a senior system analyst, in fact. But anyway, so up to 2008, companies were only working with system analysts. Well, the business, they know what they want. Well, they don't. They forget a lot of things what they think is evident, but they forget to mention it, and you don't automate it, and you are stuck in the middle of a process when you do system integration testing. Sorry. So no, I have done, from my 25 years of experience, 15 years without BAs.
Without BA, and well, I mean, did that lead to the project outcomes that we would expect? So, I mean, you mentioned some examples there, but was it as severe as we'd all expect?
Yes, there was always scope creep, always. No exception. It was always scope creep, delays, budget increase, because you are doing integration testing, and in the middle of a process, you have to go from A to B. They forgot something in the middle. Mm. And but everyone knows that. Well, we didn't. So I said, like, no, I have to sit down with the business and see how they work. And then I started to do process. I've done process analysis in 2002, where before BPMN existed, I did it with activity diagrams. Mm-hmm. And we did even business process re-engineering, and that was really on the business processes. And then after that, when I had these business process re-engineered, the application, it flew out of it. We did the data analysis, of course, but how do you use the data, and how does it shift from one phase to another? And therefore I needed the processes. Yeah. So, yeah.
Excellent.
What else can I say? But before that, fun increase and time constraints, time problems.
All of those things that we probably all witnessed firsthand, I'm sure. So Craig, what about your perspective? Have you seen situations where either the business analysis or systems analysis is missing? And if so, how did that turn out?
Well, badly, of course, but the case is that the systems analyst role has been missing for a while. And what's happened is, as with a lot of things, if there's a gap, people step into the gap. Yeah. So it's usually been, for me, the solution architects, and they would see it stepping down into that space, or you get a business analyst who's actually very good technically, steps across into that space. That's not ideal. Solution architects are quite rare, so trying to use them as systems analysts is not what, sledgehammer to crack a nut, etc. Just quickly reflecting back on something that Debbie said, it stuck in my head about data being the cornerstone of the process of the system. I had quite a difficult conversation when I was trying to educate somebody that process is king. So process analysis is what it's all about, because that's my background. And he was saying that data was more important. Of course, I lost the argument, because he made a very good point. He said, what's the point of a process step except to change data? And I thought, well, I can't say what I thought, but he's right. And it's personally because I'm very much more on the business side focused. I'm not, data isn't my hot point, but we did have to do a lot of work making sure we had that data capability somewhere. I believe the systems analyst role, whoever fills that role, and there's a different, I think it's one of the things we'll come to, there's a difference between the role and the person that does that role. So you could have a BA who could act as a business architect, they could act as a data analyst, they could even act as a dev if they've got that particular skill. Because I do think there's a gap between the business analyst and the artifacts we produce as business analysts and what the dev team need. So if you've got someone who's a pure dev, they're going to make assumptions. And I think, again, Debbie said something about it. If you're on the dev side, you get some of the BA artifacts, you think, well, I'm not entirely sure what this means, so I'll just take a guess. So that's mine.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it makes sense. And I'm reflecting on projects I've worked on, and you do see that, don't you? You see, whenever there's a gap, someone steps in, and it's human nature for a good person to do that. But sometimes then it creates a problem because, say, there's a good a BA with a technical background, they step in to plug that gap on this project. Then the next project, another BA who's got a business background comes in, and people say, well, hang on a minute, why aren't you doing all this stuff in the middle? And it creates a bit of a problem. I mean, Debbie, what's your view on that sort of situation where, because the business analysis role is so broad, and there is definitely a route that there are people who come up through tech, there are equally people who come up through the business who are differently placed with different areas of expertise.
It's true, but I think if you are going to take on work, and I'm going to just question this role concept a little bit, because actually a role is quite a difficult thing to define, and once you try to define it, particularly something like business analysis, which is so broad, you end up with people saying, well, I'm a business analyst, but that's not what I do. And the problem with business analysis, and the beauty of business analysis, it is so diverse. So it's very difficult to pigeonhole it into a particular role. But if we look at it as work that people are doing to analyse situations, and then to try and make sure that something that is delivered is going to be effective, or has the potential to be effective at the very least, then actually what that means is, if that's the work you do, and that's your profession, then actually you've got a responsibility to learn all sorts of new things as they come up, to understand that the toolkit is huge for business analysis, and you never ever stop learning about it. So I think that we need to maybe get away from having set roles, if you like, start thinking about what it is we're trying to actually deliver. And one of the things I'm very keen on, as you know, Adrian, is this idea of a service that we deliver.
Yes.
And if we understand our service that we're delivering, then we need to understand what that means we do, and therefore what skills, competencies and techniques we have in the toolkit. That way, we should be able to actually adapt to different situations. And, you know, if we come up against something we don't know, or we haven't come up against before, and I'm sure a lot of business analysts have hit the data issue a number of times, then let's put some effort into making sure we can do it. Because one of the things I think the business analysts have to be, and I know you've said this before, Adrian, is quite courageous.
Yes.
You know, I mean, as Stefan was saying, you're going into all sorts of different situations, you're going into all sorts of different business sectors, business domains, and you've got to get to grips with it. You've got to get to grips with the terminology. So getting to grips with, you know, understanding how you model data, that shouldn't be a challenge for people working in business analysis. We should be able to do that. So, you know, if we know this is the service I deliver at this particular point in this project or program or whatever, and it requires me to understand this and know about this, then actually you need to go and do it. You need to be courageous and just say, I'm going to find out, I'm going to learn, and it'll make you a better business analyst.
Absolutely, and it comes back to that idea of the boundary again. That bound. If we bound, the trouble is if we if we keep our own individual boundaries too tight, then there's always that danger we become irrelevant to the organisation, because if we don't expand into the into the adjacent possible, as it sometimes I've heard it described before, then someone else will. And,
yes.
and of course the danger is if our boundaries get smaller and smaller, then that's not a good thing for us as individuals, and it's definitely not a good thing for us as a profession. So that leads on to another related question. So one role that certainly I've seen, and I suspect we've all seen, is the BSA, or Business Systems Analyst. So Craig, I mean, in your view, do you think that it is feasible? Is it desirable to have someone doing both business and systems analysis?
At the risk of being controversial, I think it can be like the BA PM role, hybrid. There are some people who can do both well. I think they're a minority. And this is taking my professional career in my hands and maybe slightly disagreeing with Deborah. I fundamentally, my view is that I don't think the individual has to expand to cover all roles. So if I'm there as a practice lead, I am looking across all my BAs and SAs and business architects, whoever, to fill the complete role. I wouldn't expect one BA to cover it all. So back as an accountant, you've got financial accountants, tax accountants, management, a mass of them. Very few accountants I know would be experts in more than 2 or 3. And that's my view, but I think it's a limitation of people. Dare I say, it may be because we've got a very accessible profession. We get a whole range of capabilities, people. I've had people in my team who are PhDs and all that type of stuff. I've had people that have just come out of call centres. And I think we have to be aware of the individual capabilities. So now that Deborah's heard that, I might send my diploma back in pretty soon.
Well, it's interesting because the way I hear it, I think actually, and Debbie, you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but I think you actually might be agreeing, because I think what Debbie is probably saying is it's more around almost T-shaping, if I'm understanding correctly, Debbie.
Yeah, I'll go for that.
And am I interpreting you right, Debbie?
You are, because what I said was understand the service you're trying to offer. And in my view, business analysis covers a number of services, and you can specialize in a particular service, and some people do. I've actually come across business analysts who specialized in feasibility studies and business cases, which sounds, interesting, but that is absolutely true. You have other business analysts who actually specialize in what we call systems analysis, really, as a service. So you get that. But do you know, I'm going to throw something in here, Adrian. I'm going to throw the word digital in.
Oh, good.
Yes, discuss. Because digital opens up quite an interesting world, I think, now. We have got to not be frightened of technology if we're business analysts that came in from the business. I have perceived that over a number of years. And I think in today's world, we have got to understand a bit about data. I'm not saying we have to be expert data analysts or data analytics specialists, and obviously those are different things depending on our context, but we have got to understand some of these things, and we've got to understand the technological context a bit better if we're going to be relevant as business analysts in today's world. So I do sort of agree with Craig, you can't be a master of everything. But equally, if the service that you're offering requires you to learn a new skill or develop understanding of a new technique or a new technology, we have got to be more open to doing that. And I will tell Craig that when I studied back about 15, 18 years ago, the most difficult module I studied was finance.
and that's the way it should be.
And I was really nervous and apprehensive, but I sat with the books and I went over and over and over them until I understood it. And I don't think that's beyond most people.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we're getting to the end of our time slot. There's so much more that we could discuss, but what I'd like to suggest is probably the most difficult question I've asked so far. But what would your key message or key takeaway, or if you wanted people who have tuned in to take away 1 or 2 bullet points, what would those 1 or 2 bullet points be? So, so Craig, what would your 1 or 2 takeaways be from our discussion today?
Systems analysts, you need them. So it's maybe not a person who does it all, but I think you need to look, especially if you're a BA manager or whatever, you need to look across your portfolio. You need to have those skills and capabilities across your portfolio, so you know who you can pick on, that's a terrible phrase, who you can allocate to do that work. Because if you don't do that, as I said earlier, somebody else will have to pick up the slack, and that's not good for anybody, and it's suboptimal. Simple as that.
Fantastic. So systems analysts, you need them, and you need to know who they are, where they are, whether it's a role or a joint role or whatever. Stefan, what would be your 1 or 2 key takeaways?
Well, I see a few questions. We don't have the time to reply them, but it's one of those questions is, in fact, going to the takeaway I'm want to give. Is so Lindsay asks, as a practitioner within an organization, has a view of the BAs in a very IT solution-centric view, how do you break out of that placement and gain greater visibility to the broader view without being invited to the table where much of this information is discussed and shared? Yes, well, first of all, get to that table. And before you going into the system, look at the problems that needs to be solved, opportunities that are there, before you dig into the system. So first, well, the holistic system is only part. If it's a software system, it's only part of the whole organization. So if you want to change something, see what needs to be changed, and then dive into the solution in the system, software system. No.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stefan. And Debbie, what would your sort of 1 or 2 bullet points or takeaways be?
I think business analysis, we've said all the way through this discussion, is holistic. And I think business analysts should therefore be holistic too, which means that if we take something like the Poppet model, you have got to have skills in all of the different areas. And the really key takeaway I'd like to say to people is continue to learn and expand your toolkit. And if there's an area where you think, I'm really uncomfortable with that, maybe it is data, maybe it's something else, then actually set yourself a challenge and be courageous and grasp it and make yourself holistic. Yeah,
make ourselves holistic. And it is interesting, isn't it? Because another term I've heard a lot recently, and it'd be interesting to know whether this resonates, Debbie, is this idea of learned helplessness, where people sort of get stuck in a rut and they feel that they can't or shouldn't learn X, but the more they don't try or learn or be courageous in that way, the more it's like a cycle. So maybe if we step up and be courageous and step out of that when we need to.
Can I give you an alternative very quickly to that? Because it's not an alternative, it's an alternative phrase.
Yeah.
My niece, Felicity, is a fantastic person and is studying. And she said to me recently, I wrote a narrative that said I wasn't very good at exams. Actually, that's a false narrative. And I've got to stop writing narratives and then believing they're true. We can all write a different narrative, and that's what we should do.
Wow, that's really poignant. And just as you were saying that, Debbie, I was thinking we could apply that at a personal level. We could apply that at the profession. We need to write a narrative for the business analysis profession, and we need to control our narrative, because I'm not sure we do control our narrative.
Well, I think some of us try, don't we? And actually, another takeaway, Adrian, let's control the BA narrative. Yeah. Let's not let approaches, roles, people, organizations say that business analysis isn't needed, and let's stop buying into some of it. So yeah, let's control our narrative.
Well, what a fantastic and appropriate place to stop. So controlling our BA narrative. So well, fantastic. That brings us to the very end of the webinar. So all there is left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to Stefan, Debbie and Craig for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know from the number of people we had registered and the number of people we had live that this is a topic that is very, very much close to people's hearts. So thank you for sharing your experiences so openly.